We are going to record this. So just a heads up in case anyone feels, not great about their hair. This is an opportunity to turn your camera off or their beard. And yours is looking fantastic. So welcome everyone. I'm Sally. This is Radio Bootcamp, and I am so thrilled to welcome Walter Ray Watson, who goes by Walter Ray or Walter. His career has spanned so many amazing things, and I made a little short list here. He has been with National Public Radio since the late 80s. His first 2 years, he started with Susan Stamberg. He started as a production assistant. He went on to lead Weekend All Things Considered for nearly 9 years. He has done a Neiman Fellowship. And since 2018, he has been with the national desk. So I hope that I didn't get anything. Nothing was inaccurate.
That's fairly accurate. Yes.
Awesome.
That's me. That would be me.
So Walter, could you start by telling us what exactly is your job? And folks, we encourage questions. As you come up with questions, please pop them in the chat and I will convey them to Walter. Thanks. So yeah, what's your job?
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you, Sally, for inviting me to do this for the boot camp. My job is essentially a jack of all trades. It's a Swiss Army knife of radio and audio production, journalism, everything from reporting and research to editing interviews, coming up with ideas, editing both audio and scripts, working with editors, giving feedback to station reporters, going out into the field and working with correspondents and reporters on different stories, often gathering, doing my own reporting in service of those of stories that require more than one reporter at the site, on the scene. Sometimes doing my own reporting and doing my own stories. There are producers at NPR who do far more reporting than I do. I do a lot of feature work. I'd say the past 4 to 5 years, I've done a number of advanced obituaries for cultural figures. I did one quite a while ago for Sidney Poitier, for Tony Bennett. Some of these things are done so that the network isn't caught empty-handed when huge cultural figures die, when they pass away. So, because to wait until they die to pull something together is a fraught proposition. And so it's sort of been a sideline in between bigger work. I do that. And it's just like feature reporting. I mean, you're simply.
Let me break in and ask you, because you're
ask me
describing,
anything.
and guys, by the way, please, I'm going to mute you. If you're not muted, I'm just going to bop in and mute you. And if you have questions, Walter would love to hear them. Please drop them in the chat and I'll convey them. You've described so many different jobs: editor, reporter, producer, pitcher of story ideas, being out in the field. How do you break down the different skills? What are the most valuable skills for each of those different jobs? I guess maybe we can divide them most simply into editor, reporter, producer.
Okay, well, let's start with what I principally do, which is producer. I think at base, all of these jobs require a certain amount of curiosity, a willingness to be open and learn new things. You also have to work at and continue to hone your skills as a writer, to be a good listener, both in interviews and with the people that you're working with. I also say that being organized, being prepared, planning ahead for any and all stories that you're working on. Um, that openness, the being open to learning new things is a matter of, um, you'll make mistakes along the way. There's no question about it. And sometimes those mistakes will help you. Um, well, making those mistakes will help you be better next time. But at base, you really don't want to be just stumbling the whole way through
So
an
I
assignment.
was gonna ask you this later, but I know I've made
Sorry.
some really big mistakes. Like I left Radio Lab's shotgun microphone in a taxi and it took me 3 days to track it down. Can you share any mistakes that you've made, small or
Oh,
big?
sure, sure. I mean, over the years, and certainly my early years at NPR, there were instances where I may have gone out and done an interview and um, the tape failed, or we use cassette machines, if anybody has heard of that. And sometimes a tape machine can fail, and you think you're recording and you didn't hit the record button, or you forgot to take off the pause button. And I I can't remember the exact interview I did, but there were a few in which something like that happened, or I hit pause and missed a really important part of my questions, because I would have come with a line of questions for my interview, and I had to call the guest, the person, back up and say, "I'm very sorry, but I need to ask you these questions again because my equipment failed." And you hope that they'll agree to it. Most of I mean, going back to my earlier life, it was a lot easier to get people to come back, to allow me to go back out and get them. Those were back in the days when, and that's interviewing people within the Washington area, the greater DMV. But there are instances where that preparation um, is key, because you're covering the aftermath of a hurricane, and you talk to people about their loss of home or um, or livelihood, and you're not going to be able to get that back very easily. So I haven't had a really crucial uh, mistake like that. I did in post production, having come back to NPR uh, from a larger story we did on the potential closing of the Apollo Theater. I put a tape in a machine I was unfamiliar with, and I lost about 20 seconds, 20 crucial seconds of an interview we had, because part of the story was talking to folks on the Wednesday night when they when they auditioned, and we spoke to the winner, and I pushed the wrong button on this machine listening back, and it completely deleted his response, his excitement to winning. And we went all the way up to New York to get this. You're not going to replicate that ever. And so you're back in Washington. And I realized, like, within one beat what I had done, and I stopped the machine, but I forever had lost his excitement.
And
And just,
it's still occupying your brain space today.
well, I haven't thought about it until now, and it's really talk about cringy moments. I wish I hadn't brought it up, but but
Sorry, we can pin that on me. That's definitely, that goes in the category of my mistakes. What, speaking about challenging reporting, oh, if someone's not muted, if you could mute yourself, that would be awesome. Thank you. Challenging reporting scenarios. You were there on the night of the Capitol 6 riots, or the
The January 6th.
January 6th riots. And by the way, for those of you who are just joining us and you have questions for Walter Ray, please pop them in the chat. Can you talk about how you handled that scenario, what that was like?
Well, it started out not being so daunting because from the standpoint of I was at home when around 20 of 2, I started to see these pictures on television. And it was only at about 4 o'clock that folks at headquarters started thinking about what we're going to cover going into the evening, because there still hadn't been a vote, or not a vote, but a count to verify and validate the electoral votes. And what happened, I was on a briefing call that afternoon, and NPR has a public safety officer who talks about what we need, how we need to be prepared to go into a potentially hostile situation, and whether it even makes sense. And one of the warnings we were given was that nothing is more important than your life. If you feel in any way threatened, walk away. I came into HQ with Scott Scott Horsley, and after the briefing, I picked him up because he doesn't live too far from me, about a mile from me here in Washington, and we drove in together. And I said, if for any reason the situation goes south, I'm walking away, and I hope you'll do the same. We suited up with Kevlar and ceramic plates in these jackets. I wore what's essentially a skateboarder helmet, so I'm not exactly going to fit into the crowd. And I also had ballistic eyewear. I had glasses over my glasses, so that if any kind of rocks or pebbles were thrown, it wouldn't affect my eyesight. I'd have a fighting chance to get away. So that was the prep. We walked up to people and started interviewing them down by Union Station, just before you get to the Capitol. The DC Amtrak train station is about a block and a half from the start of the grounds of the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol. And so there was a bar and hotel caddy corner diagonally from Union Station, and we're talking to people who weren't necessarily the rioting folks, but they were certainly Donald Trump supporters, MAGA fans, and so they had a drink or something, and they were standing outside their hotel, and we're stepping up to ask questions, and some folks tried to not even jostle us, but just rattle us by yelling, like, "Hey, you don't need to be here," this kind of stuff. Because they saw the tape recorder out. I was holding a mic on people. We both had tape recorders, but I essentially started recording, and so that just sort of got you ready for what you might run into. People rattling you, but it could get worse, right? And I mean, I'd seen a lot of what went on that afternoon, and the city by 6:30 was under curfew, but we were press, and it's different for us. We could show our credentials. We were told not to wear our lanyards around our necks because people were known to be pulled by the throat during the day. And that was also the reason why we were told, if you need to drop your equipment and run, you can always replace your equipment. You can't replace you. We did not experience any violence per se directly at us, but by that time, by 7 o'clock that night, there were between 250 and 300 National Guard, Capitol Police, and Metropolitan Police in riot gear, and they were continuing to move people further out from a perimeter from the Capitol. And at one point, while we were conducting interviews in such a way where, while Scott was asking questions and I've got a microphone on the guest, I'm keeping my eyes and ears open for any possible threat to us physically. And it did get to be a little threatening because some of the people we interviewed would say things like, those weren't MAGA people who went into the Capitol. Those weren't Proud Boys. That was Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And one character stared directly at me when he was saying Black Lives Matter, trying to elicit some response. And it wasn't about me, but if he had tried something physical, I would have made a move in the opposite direction. But those are some of the things that happened. Another thing that happened, I'll share, was that there was the unfortunate death of the former Air Force member of the Air Force, who was shot because she wouldn't get back from the door to the chamber, and to the House chamber. And someone on a megaphone, because there were hundreds of people out that night away from the Capitol, and there were folks on megaphones, and lots of folks looking at their Twitter feeds and Truth Social feeds. And so things were repeated, from there into our microphones, basically. That it was a unique experience in that it wasn't. I came with this notion that people had talking points, and in its experiencing in real time, folks saying things on megaphones, because what one person said on megaphone was that they killed a 14-year-old girl, and that's not what happened. But within 3 minutes of the time that someone shouted that on a megaphone, we're interviewing a guy, and he's saying to Scott, "Why would they kill a 14-year-old girl?" And so it wasn't a matter of folks having prepared or agreed upon propaganda to spread, but that hook, line, and sinker, folks were repeating disinformation as truth because it's what they genuinely believed. And so that was something I was not prepared for because I had not experienced it firsthand like that. But one other thing I'll share about the the riot gear police out in full force. As they're pushing people back, one officer looked directly at me while I was holding this microphone and Scott was doing an interview. And the policeman said, we're going to be arresting people really soon. And so that was sort of a signal to me that I didn't want to be where I was standing. And he saw that I was press. And so it was also a sort of confusing moment because I didn't know if he was saying that police officers were going to take advantage of the situation and maybe, club people because they didn't get to push back and they weren't in that kind of force during the afternoon. Or I just didn't know what that meant. But what I first and foremost interpreted to mean was that we had to move. We had to get where we weren't. And it was like, I said to Scott, we can continue to talk to this guy, but we have to move further out because he's completely oblivious. And that's why NPR sent us out in teams. There were 3 teams of us out that night, and we were feeding audio back to and talking live as needed because we had a live broadcast, special coverage of the Capitol of Congress coming back together after the earlier rioting. And we were supposed to have had a live shot at 8:00, but of course that's when Mike Pence convened, brought everybody to order. And so we didn't get on the air until maybe 9:15. And so we just and we were we were connected by FaceTime
You
audio.
you mentioned people feeding you misinformation, right? There was all this disinformation flying around on these social media platforms. What kind of quick editorial decisions did you have to make, to figure out which of these false claims are we going to include in our reporting, and how are we going to frame those for the audience?
Well, this was also part of our preparatory our briefing. We were told that we were charged with only asking about three questions. One was, where are you from? Um, did you accomplish what you set out to? And what will you do next? We were told not to challenge the people on the ground in any way, shape, or form to their beliefs. It was more to get a perspective of people who were there on the ground. It was not to say, Donald Trump did lose the election. I mean, we're not to get into any of that, because anything that would rile them wasn't worth it. We just wanted to get a sort of a snapshot of what their thinking was, and also an idea of how close or how far away they traveled. I mean, we were talking to people who came all the way from New Hampshire, from Arizona, to be there um, simply for the rally, and they weren't and so they were committed to being there until all activities were over and done with. And so that was interesting. I mean, one of the other things that I noticed, and we did not have the resources, the time, the ability to capture, was that there were some Black and brown people also at this event, and we really didn't get to talk to them. And to this moment, I still regret not being able to ask why they were participating or interested in being on the grounds of the Capitol with those who were staunchly opposed to to see why they were there. But it stood to reason that they weren't there as opposition. They did not carry any signs. They did not behave in a way that they were opposed to what was going on. And so I really wanted to know what they were thinking, and what, where their minds were, what they had to say about what was going on around them.
I
Didn't get
like
to do that.
I like that as a journalist, you're automatically fact checking any assumptions you might make just because somebody is there in the crowd doesn't mean that they're share a certain viewpoint.
It
So I
doesn't.
just wanted to point that out for the audience. I think that's so important. Um,
Yeah.
are,
So I mean, just to come back to your question, we weren't there we would not have had the wherewithal to really ask people about ask beyond their perspective what they were thinking. We didn't have the ability to ask why they thought that, particularly in an environment where we're completely and utterly outnumbered. And if folks decided to turn violent, that would just encourage that kind of activity, because so many there were saying, "Oh, you're fake news, huh? You're NPR, are you?" So so we didn't want to rile that at all. We just wanted to get their point of view, and we tried to give them um, the ability to express themselves freely. And so we weren't trying to get into a debate over whether we're fake news or whatever they wanted to bring to the table.
I want to ask a question and then I want to there's a good question in the chat from Mallory. Thank you, Mallory. We'll get to that in just a moment. Um, Do you have any advice for reporters who are going to be covering the election or other contentious issues, climate change, flat earthers, about best practices for approaching people who may immediately say, "You're a journalist, fake news, I'm not going to talk to you." Are there any ways that you think it can be helpful to approach folks who may be not inclined to talk to a reporter?
Well, I mean, you can let the people or the person know that that you're there to honestly hear their perspective, to get to share what they have to say about the subject and why they believe what they believe. You're not there to challenge their belief system, but you want to tell a fuller, uh, more well-rounded story, than they would expect from you, or expect from mainstream, or from any news organization. But you're there to hear what they have to say. And a lot of there are people who may never um, agree with that, and will continue to say, no, I'm not talking to you. And you just have to accept that and let it go. But you can certainly try. If you're going into any hostile environment, I mean, what's key is that you're safe, is that you don't put yourself in a position you're where you can't get out, where you can't just walk away. I mean, recognize that, equipment can be replaced, but you can't. Um, there's no story that's that important. I mean, we often come across these documentaries of journalists who are in war zones, um, who cover these things. And it's not that they don't suffer PTSD. It's not that they don't recognize that they're in a dangerous, they're risking their lives to tell a story. Um, but it has to be right for you. Um, and our political discourse is pretty coarse right now. We're pretty divided as a country. And so you just have to make sure that you're safe, and that you're good with being in a situation that might be a bit challenging. But um, again, no story, as our public safety officers told us, no story is more important than your own lives, your own public safety,
Oh,
your own safety.
so some journalists and producers, they feed off of that. And, some of us get adrenaline from breaking news and, the constant um, daily news cycle. But there's a question here from Mallory. She says, I'm curious, or they say, I'm curious, how do you stay inspired in finding stories to pursue, especially with your long career in audio and journalism? And they point out that for them personally, the daily grind of news wears their creative side down. So how do you stay inspired when you're trying to find stories?
Well, I think part of what helps me is that invariably I often ask the question, what perspective is missing, or what voices are missing from a story. I mean, sometimes I can be energized simply by thinking of individuals, of demographic groups that aren't included, that don't seem to be heard from as much. And so then my job becomes trying to find out, how can I get to those people. Sometimes it's younger voters, if it's an election story. Sometimes it's a racial or ethnic group that's not represented in the story. A really quick aside, when when I started thinking about journalism seriously, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was an English major, and I was reading the student paper, and this was back 1979, 80, and I noticed that no one was asking the question, and this was a fairly naive question even for me, but if the election were held today, would you who would you want for president, Ted Kennedy um, or Jimmy Carter? And like I say, it was a naive question because it was a landslide for Ronald Reagan. Um, but it seemed to me that it was a question that wasn't answered on the pages of my student newspaper, and it became an unscientific straw poll that I did, talking to folks on campus, professors and students alike. And it became the first story that I ever did for the student newspaper. But I share that to say that I've always been someone interested in figuring out why a situation is the way it is, why people think the way they do. I think I was born with the word why. And I'm not bragging. I think a lot of us are born with a question like that. Why can't I go outside? Why can't I have cheeseburgers for breakfast?
So let
Um,
me interrupt because this is the
please
perfect
do.
to interject with a question from the chat, and please continue if I cut you off in the middle
No,
of.
I'm
Um, okay, so this question comes from Brooke Peterson, and they want to know if editorial judgment is more of an instinct or something that can be learned, and is there, a set of questions you ask yourself to help vet ideas? You already mentioned perspectives that aren't told and the why question, but are there other things that you ask to help vet an idea as pitch worthy or newsworthy?
Mhm. Well, news judgment can come over time. I think everybody benefits from a good editor and a good edit, and more experienced hands can often help. It also helps to look at how stories are constructed in different media, not just the New York Times, not just CBS News, if that's your favorite, not just NPR. Um, I mean, ProPublica. You can look at a frontline documentary and get to learn a lot about how decisions affect the way the story is told, what information is included, what things are even a completely fine story. You can think about what's missing, what they didn't include, and just consider in your own mind why wasn't that part of the story. And maybe it's a story for another day, or maybe they just ran out of time. But I think um, it's often good, even after you've done a story, if there's someone whose judgment you respect, to let them go over it with you, or give them your feedback on what they liked about the stories. Are there ways that you could have constructed it better or differently? What would have made it sharper, more engaging? There's many ways to do that. I mean, I often send out stories even after they're done, even after I think they're really good and it's already produced and it's already on the air, and it's like, what could I have done differently? You know? So I think having come up the way I did, I had the benefit of lots of different people editing long form uh, interviews and conversations to decide what stays in and what goes out. I mean, from from when I started to now, what's considered long form has shrunken, certainly in broadcast. Um, but it's important to remember what are the essential things that people need to know in a story on a given day. What's the essential piece of information, or parts of a profile that help you understand um, what makes this person tick. If you're doing a profile of a person, and if you don't get it directly from them, ask people who know or knew them in different contexts, what made them, what makes them who they are, and over time you get to get a sense of, from different people, whether what you've learned is true. I hope that helps. I hope that answered
Yeah.
the question.
And when you're editing, because I think you have to wear, and then we have some more questions from the chat, but I just wanted to follow up with that because you're talking sort of like with an editor's spectacles on about editing a profile or about how to think of a profile. When you're wearing your editor's glasses, are there a few basic questions you immediately ask yourself, or a few basic mistakes that you think new reporters should watch out for when writing stories?
Well, I think um, first and foremost, because a lot of what I'm involved in working on the national desk is often the why. Why are we telling this story now? So what's important to know today, to know this week about this person or this situation? What is actually valuable beyond the nowness of it? What is it that a listener or reader will take away. And, am I including enough of that in the story to give people something to think about? It's not so much to convince them of a person's perspective, or or um or that, it's not to convince people that climate change is real. It's to understand, what is the struggle, what is the conflict, that people are facing, or what are the consequences, what is the impact of an event or of a person's actions. And so, uh, those things, it may be exciting, and you may be drawn into, um, a person who has a really charismatic personality, and sometimes they are the story. But it's often good to think about, well, beyond, the excitement or the vitriol, if it's a mean kind of person, um, why does he or she matter? What is it that beyond the sort of spark that they ignite in you to want to know more about them? What is it that you can share with an audience? That, what would you tell your brother, your next door neighbor, your high school buddy, in just plain spoken English, that they would get a lot out of?
This is a bit of a follow-up question. This comes from Sarah Sterland, and they're asking about what are the best methods of getting out of your own bubble, and hearing from communities that may not be as heard from as much. And they mentioned they don't mean reading other publications. And I know I just tell my students to like go outside and talk to human beings,
Yes.
like take a walk, but maybe you have other advice.
No, talking to human beings is really essential. I mean, it's not. I mean, um, it's easy to get stuck on this thing here, and talking to people who you already know on Zoom. It's it can be hard, difficult to strike up conversations, and yet and still, um, it's important. I mean, you know, um, I'm going to say two things here. Coming back to the news judgment thing, you're always learning. Understand that you can make the right decision one day, and then the next day, it's not that everything has changed, but it's that, you may have a more nuanced sense of what's important, what it is that you're trying to get across, and what belongs in that story, or what belongs in that interview. Coming back to talking to people, um, I think um, it's good to strike up a conversation if you can, on a bus, on a train, on the sidewalk, and yeah, talking to people who aren't necessarily your neighbors, and you don't necessarily approach it as an interview, but as a conversation, because it makes you better over time when you are at the scene of something, and you just need to naturally talk with people. I mean, yes, there's a microphone, but it's more important to let them see your face, and understand that you genuinely want to know what they're thinking, what's on their minds. And it's not that, yeah, I'm a member of the press, and you need to talk to me, and I'm just gonna suck the life force out of your brain. It's like it's not like that. And because a lot of people right now, I mean, thanks to TV shows, make the media, make reporters look like a pack of mad dogs. I mean, I love and hate, Law and Order, the TV show, for that reason. It's like every single time you see reporters on the steps of a courthouse, and they're just, and it's not exactly like that, you know. I
Um,
mean,
this this question I'll just follow up in a super casual way, as if, like you and I are just standing in line at the deli, and I found out, oh my gosh, you're a senior producer at NPR. That's so cool. I have a question for you, if that's okay. Um, this one comes from Emma. They thank you for your expertise today. And I don't personally think you're on the hiring side of things, but they wanted to know what qualities you look for or you value um, in people you work with. And I'd also like to I'd like to do an add-on to that question, which is, I know being a professor, there are certainly, I think, skills students come in thinking they need versus what they really need. So I'm curious if you have like a top 3 or like a bulleted list of like skills you really value when people are new to the industry.
Well, I mean, it's like I said at the top. I mean, first and foremost is being curious, which comes back to the earlier question about getting out of your safe zone, your comfort zone. Um, you have to be willing to ask questions that are not just your belief system, not just how you would like the world to be. Um, and so, as itchy and scratchy as some media are to watch or listen to or even read, um, it's important to know that other people are absorbing and consuming their information from these things. And so to be sensitive to the way that other people think, and not expect them to agree with you, to ask open-ended questions. you know, um, you can say, in Pennsylvania, fracking is a big issue, and I'm wondering, I'm here in Pittsburgh today. I'm just curious, what do you think about fracking? Should it be stopped? Should it be expanded? Is there's many different perspectives on it. I just want to hear what yours is. Do you think about it? You know, did that answer that question?
I think so. And guys, just for, I know we've had folks joining all along. Feel free to, please, not feel free, please throw your questions in the chat casually, just as if we were all just like hanging out
Send
in
it to
the
Zoom.
at the post office. This question comes from Ed Colson. And they're wondering if you've got so much amazing experience and you've covered everything from obituaries to the Capitol riots to interviewing arts and cultural luminaries. Are there aspects of your job you still find tricky, challenging?
Well, yes. Going into going into natural disasters, or the aftermath, covering the aftermath of natural disasters. A number of these things. I mean, I'll just mention it and come back to the natural disaster bit, because I was at the site of hurricane damage, about 2 years ago in Florida. But well, I'll stick with the hurricane because I've forgotten what I was going to say. It's Oh yes, it's the other thing I was going to say was I was also in Minneapolis for the trial of the officer whose knee was on the neck of George Floyd. I was there for about 5.5 weeks, covering it from a hotel room, with reporters. These things can be highly traumatic, and even being in the aftermath of of a hurricane that has wiped out people's livelihoods, their homes. They don't know which way is up. Those things can be real super challenging, and for me, even looking back on covering the night of January 6th, I curled up into a ball after I was done with that work, because nothing bad happened to me, but I was not aware, for example, of the gallows that had been erected until I saw it that night. Um, but what I'm trying to say is that, those kinds of things can be with you for a while, um, and it's important to recharge, to step away, and maybe even do stories that are um, that are less stressful. But covering hard news, covering um, events like that, because I was in events like in Florida with, where we went to several different communities, and I'm working with different reporters to help them gather their stories. So I'm helping to record, I'm logging their audio, I'm assembling stories that get mixed and sent back to Washington to be put on shows, sitting on edits, lining up more interviews for the next day. Debbie Elliott was working on one story, and I'm catching up with people involved with farming and in the Farmers Bureau to find out, if they can line me up with different people who are involved with both agriculture and livestock, so that they could talk um, about their losses, or um, how they're trying to salvage what they've lost because of flooding, or if there's anything to salvage. Um, and so those things can be super tricky, super challenging, because you don't know what you're going to get. And it literally is sort of a lottery of continuing to call, continuing to dial, asking the last person you talk to, is there someone else? Is there a neighbor that I should also talk to? Um, can we have are there phone numbers or emails that we can have for you, so we can contact you later? We may have follow-up questions. We may want to see what's going on 6 months from now. And so all those things are valuable. I mean, you may not contact them 6 months from now, but you just want to have that resource. You just want to be able to have that at your fingertips, so that if it's not a story you're working on, you can pass it on to someone else. You just never know.
How long is your contact list at this point?
Oh my God. It's in the hundreds. I mean, a lot of it's Outlook. I mean, it used to be a Rolodex, which was, I miss Rolodexes personally. I know that everybody we're all, by nature connected to our computers and cell phones, and it's far more accessible to everybody else, right? You can just hit a couple buttons and boom, you've sent off the contacts to whomever needs it. But there's just something more natural, more tactile. I grew up cutting tape with splicing tape and a razor blade and a grease pencil, and so that helped inform the way that I cut interviews. I mean, my ears are still pretty sharp to keeping breaths in when people speak. So but yeah, it's several hundreds, if over 1,000 for sure. And there's lots of dead numbers that I haven't looked at. I mean, I have a lot of numbers. Oh my God, because I've worked in so many different contexts and on so many different stories, and sadly, it's not organized the way it should be. But yeah, but they're there. I mean, the benefit of working for a place like NPR is that I can go back into a story where I worked with a reporter, and I can see that name, and then I can check to see if I've got it in my contacts. But we also have the benefit of a research and researchers and archivists who can help us find phone numbers for people. And so they have deep databases. So anything that we lost or don't have, they can help us track down people.
I would like to have a wizard like that at my beck and call. Um, what what do you read every morning? What do you read and listen to? What's your daily list?
Well, let's see. For sure, I'm listening to either the podcast of Morning Edition, the Up First podcast. Um, but I still rely on my clock radio to start playing Morning Edition. But it's just so that if I've missed some top stories, the pod will get me there. I look at the Washington Post website for their 7 top stories. Um, the Times I'll catch up with later in the day. Um, let's see what else did I do. Definitely catch the news, the NPR newscast headlines. Um, I I occasionally will switch on different public radio stations. Sorry, lots of public radio in here. But I'll listen to KCRW, um, KPCC, which is now called the LAist. I'll check the middle of the country, either Chicago Public Radio. Occasionally, I'll listen to what's happening in Colorado, just to have a sense of what else is going on in the world. And I I often stay away from television, except for maybe the BBC. I mean, I have cable, so I have the benefit of watching the BBC News, which is every hour on, every minute on the minute practically. So those things will get me started. I mean, because I'm covering and working with reporters who are covering domestic news for the most part, those are the things that I have the most, I stay in touch with the most. And of course, I also have the benefit of a daily 11 a.m. call where bureau chiefs and desk editors on the national desk are talking about the coverage that they're planning for the day, what they have scheduled, and what other things are being added to assign reporters or try and get stations to help us cover, by midday or the afternoon. And so that helps me also know what other stories I need to dig into or search for.
A lot of us are members of groups, organizations like AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio, all kinds of different groups out
Very
there.
good organization. I relied on you guys for many years to help us get tape syncs before the invention of Zoom. But go
Um,
ahead.
do
Finish
you,
your thought. I'm sorry.
oh yeah, no, that's okay. This question comes from Deanna. They want to know, do you belong to any journalism societies or groups? Do you find that kind of thing useful for you in your work?
I'm a member of the of NABJ, which is National Association of Black Journalists. Um, that's the only one I'm signed up for right now. Um, I I I really haven't been with many other, following many other organizations. It would benefit me to do so, but I sort of feel as though through NPR I'm connected not just to the people who work for the network, but also it's very easy for me to get connected with folks at different public radio stations and check in with them and ask questions of news directors, ask questions of individual reporters if I've heard or seen something on a website. And even if I can't talk to them directly, I might be able to get a Slack message to them if they're on Slack.
What are
Um,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's all I have to say.
This question's from Amy Isaacson, whose name seems very familiar. What are your tips for teaching reporters who go out on their own and don't have the benefit of a producer like you to gather scene tape, especially when the sound is not obvious? And do you have suggestions for helping to teach reporters to use sound in their pieces?
Yes, as a producer and occasional reporter, I often think in terms of sound. I think because sound helps to make pictures more vivid in the listener's mind. So if I'm going out to do a story, or if a reporter is going out to do a story, I tend to think in terms of, what is this story about? What where are you going to interview the people in the story? If it's a story that's, I don't know, I keep picking on fracking. But if it helps to give people a sense of the individual's space as they consider a story like fracking, if it's possible for you to go into their homes, if it's possible to be on their property, to stand in their yard and gather sound of what it's like standing in that yard, and get that sound close to where you were standing to interview them. So if it's possible to ask them to be quiet for 45 seconds, a minute, and just stand there with you, that's best. If that's not possible, then try to get that approximate placement and sound so people get a sense around where you were interviewing them. If you're at a coffee shop and you hear and the piece of music is playing at that Starbucks, um, ideally you would want to ask that person, maybe even particularly if the conversation is going well, or if there's a fire engine going by and you're sitting outside, just ask them, excuse me, I got to get the sound right here, and we'll pick up a question on the other side of it, or an ambulance, or any sort of loud, noisy spaces. It's important to sort of gather that, so that you have it, to both give a sense of where you were at the time, and also to mask noisiness that might be in the middle of the interview. Um, it comes it comes over time. I mean, once upon a time at NPR, we were able to go out with audio engineers, and they worried about gathering that sound, but you as the producer would eyeball, can we get, more sound of, I don't know, that that rustling of the trees, in Audubon Park in New Orleans, or the birds, twittering away. Um, so that you have that to help inform the spaces that you've been in, so that people get a stronger sense of being somewhere, and being in that same place with the people interviewed. We often will just gather up sound, like in a space like where we are right now, and there ain't no sound, right? It's the sound of silence. That's not going to help. I mean, sometimes the story is told, quite well with just the individual telling you their experience. But if you have the opportunity to give a little bit more of their lived experience in their spaces, that was the benefit, especially of having tape syncers, and having people go where I can't be, if they're halfway across the country and I can't travel for just that one interview, to actually gather some sound, in the kitchen where they're interviewed, you know, and you ask an independent producer to gather that sound for you. And sometimes that sound might be the thing that opens the story, in in Betty Newcastle's kitchen. She was about to sit down to breakfast, and was frying up bacon or whatever. And if that's possibly, and you don't fabricate, of course, but maybe it's just a cup of coffee, and the Keurig or the kettle is boiling. You get sound of that, and those 2 to 5 seconds that's in the clear, it places the listener somewhere that they wouldn't otherwise be, and it gives you a different sense of how this person is living, and that they're human beings. They're not, aliens from outer space.
I'm hearing be bossy. Both reporters and producers come up with different options for sound, and like you said, get sounds that will create sound pictures, put listeners in their place. Okay, we're really supposed to wrap up now, so in like 10 seconds, tell us what's next for Walter Ray Watson. What should we listen for next from you?
Goodness gracious. Well, I'm working on a semi top secret project right now, and I'm not taking questions.
That's the perfect ending. Walter Ray, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, audience. You have been awesome.
Thanks for all
Um,
your questions, and it's a really a deep honor to be asked to talk about, you know the things that I've had the opportunity and really the privilege to do, for more than 3 decades.